What if the relationship is not breaking your heart loudly, but quietly erasing who you are? What if the person you love slowly became the reason you feel smaller, quieter, less alive? What if you've been losing yourself for so long that you no longer even notice it happening anymore? Because that is how it usually begins. Not with screaming, not with obvious cruelty, not with dramatic moments that instantly make you want to leave. It begins subtly, quietly, psychologically. At first, it feels like small things, small comments, small reactions, small moments that make you question yourself for just a second. You brush them off. You tell yourself it is not a big deal. You convince yourself you are overthinking. But slowly, something inside you starts changing. You hesitate before speaking. You replay conversations in your head after they end. You begin explaining yourself too much. You become careful with your tone, your words, your reactions. You start feeling nervous about how they will respond to simple things. And without realizing it, your personality slowly starts adapting around someone else's emotional comfort. That is the dangerous part. Some people do not destroy your confidence aggressively. They dim your light gradually through emotional conditioning. One reaction at a time. One criticism at a time. One emotionally uncomfortable moment at a time. Until eventually, you no longer act naturally around them. And maybe what hurts the most is that from the outside, the relationship may still look normal. There are no obvious signs of emotional destruction, no dramatic evidence, no clear moment where everything changed. But inside you, something feels different. You laugh less freely. You speak less confidently. You overthink more. You feel emotionally tired after spending time with them instead of emotionally safe. And the strange part is that many people do not recognize this as emotional damage because it does not always feel intentionally cruel. Sometimes, the person still says they love you. Sometimes, they still show affection. Sometimes, they still make you feel wanted. That confusion is exactly what keeps people trapped emotionally. Because when pain is mixed with affection, your mind struggles to clearly identify what is happening. And slowly, your emotional world starts revolving around maintaining peace, avoiding tension, and protecting the relationship from conflict, even if it means abandoning parts of yourself in the process. That is why so many people wake up one day and realize they no longer recognize the person they became inside the relationship. Not because they changed naturally, but because they slowly became emotionally smaller in order to feel emotionally accepted. And today, you are going to understand the hidden psychological ways someone can slowly disconnect you from your confidence, identity, emotional freedom, and inner light, while making you believe it is love. Because sometimes the person dimming your light is the same person convincing you they are protecting it. Most people think emotional damage comes from huge moments: the betrayal, the screaming, the obvious disrespect. But sometimes the deepest damage comes from things so small that you barely notice them happening at first. A comment, a facial expression, a reaction, a subtle criticism disguised as honesty. You're too emotional. You always overreact. You take things too seriously. You used to be more fun. You're embarrassing yourself. And maybe none of those sentences sounded devastating individually. Maybe some of them even sounded harmless. Maybe they laughed afterward. Maybe they told you they were just joking, but your nervous system still absorbed every single one of them. That is how emotional erosion works. Not loudly, quietly, repeatedly, because confidence is rarely destroyed overnight. People lose confidence sentence by sentence, reaction by reaction. Little moments that slowly teach them to doubt themselves more and express themselves less. And after enough of those moments, something starts happening psychologically. You begin editing yourself before they can criticize you again. You think twice before speaking. You stop expressing excitement as openly. You become more careful with your opinions. You start analyzing your own personality while trying to predict what might annoy them, disappoint them, or trigger another uncomfortable reaction. And eventually, self-expression no longer feels natural. It feels risky. That is one of the most dangerous parts of subtle emotional control. The person may never directly tell you to become smaller, but slowly, your mind learns that being fully yourself creates emotional discomfort inside the relationship. So you adapt. You soften parts of yourself. You hide certain emotions. You silence certain thoughts. You reduce your own light little by little just to maintain emotional peace. And what makes this psychologically confusing is that these comments are often mixed with affection. One moment they criticize you, the next moment they compliment you. One day they make you feel insecure. The next day they make you feel loved again. That inconsistency creates emotional confusion because your mind keeps focusing on the moments when they make you feel valued while minimizing the moments that slowly damaged your self-worth. And over time, you stop realizing how much your behavior changed around them. You become less spontaneous, less expressive, less emotionally free. Not because that is who you truly are, but because your nervous system adapted to emotional caution. And the saddest part is that many people blame themselves for this transformation. They start believing they became too sensitive, too emotional, or too difficult, when in reality, they were slowly being conditioned to question themselves constantly. That is how people lose pieces of their identity without realizing it. Not through one traumatic moment, but through hundreds of emotionally subtle moments that quietly teach them they are safer when they are smaller. And, eventually, you stop expressing yourself naturally at all. One of the clearest signs that someone is slowly dimming your light is this: you no longer feel fully like yourself around them. And maybe you did not notice it immediately because the change happened gradually. Human beings adapt emotionally, little by little. That is why emotional shrinking rarely feels dramatic while it is happening. At first, you still speak freely. You still laugh loudly. You still express your opinions naturally. But after enough criticism, tension, uncomfortable reactions, emotional distance, or subtle judgment, your nervous system begins adjusting automatically. You become quieter, more careful, more emotionally filtered. You stop sharing certain thoughts because you already know how they might react. You stop expressing excitement because their response makes you feel foolish, dramatic, immature, or annoying. You stop bringing up certain emotions because every difficult conversation somehow leaves you feeling guilty afterward. And eventually, something dangerous starts happening psychologically. You begin prioritizing emotional safety over authenticity. That changes a person deeply. Because now you're no longer asking, how do I express myself honestly? You are asking, how do I avoid emotional discomfort? That is survival mode. And the scary part is that many people mistake this adaptation for maturity or compromise. They tell themselves, I'm just trying to keep the peace. I don't want unnecessary conflict. I'm learning to control my emotions better. But healthy relationships do not require you to slowly disappear emotionally in order to survive inside them. Healthy love does not make self-expression feel dangerous. Yet, many people trapped in emotionally unhealthy relationships slowly start becoming smaller without even noticing it. They stop singing freely, stop laughing naturally, stop dressing the way they want, stop speaking confidently, stop sharing dreams, opinions, emotions, ideas, not because they truly changed, but because psychologically their nervous system learned that visibility creates emotional risk. And over time, you become emotionally hyper-aware of the other person's reactions. Their tone changes your mood. Their silence creates anxiety. Their approval determines whether you feel emotionally secure or emotionally rejected. That level of emotional adaptation slowly disconnects people from their natural identity. And perhaps the saddest part is this: many people do not even realize how much they changed until they spend time away from the relationship and suddenly feel lighter again, freer again, more themselves again. Because emotional shrinking becomes difficult to notice while living inside the environment causing it. That is why this rarely feels toxic in the beginning. It feels like love, adjustment, compromise, loyalty. But little by little, you stop being fully yourself because being fully yourself no longer feels emotionally safe. And once someone gains that much emotional influence over your behavior, the relationship starts affecting something even deeper than your confidence. It starts shaping your emotional reality itself. One of the reasons people stay trapped in emotionally unhealthy relationships for so long is because toxic control rarely appears as obvious control in the beginning. It disguises itself as love, as protection, as concern, as emotional closeness. That is what makes it psychologically dangerous. Because if someone clearly tried to control your life from the start, your instincts would immediately recognize the danger. But emotional control often enters the relationship slowly, wrapped inside behaviors that seem caring on the surface. At first, jealousy can feel flattering. Possessiveness can feel like passion. Constant checking can feel like attention. Emotional dependency can feel like deep connection. And because many people associate intensity with love, they mistake control for emotional investment. That confusion changes everything. Someone questions the way you dress and calls it protection. Someone becomes upset when you spend time with other people and calls it love. Someone isolates you emotionally and calls it loyalty. Someone criticizes you constantly and calls it honesty. And little by little, emotionally unhealthy behavior starts becoming emotionally justified. That is why toxic control becomes so difficult to recognize, because the problem is not only the behavior itself, it is the emotional meaning attached to it. When control is disguised as caring, your mind struggles to identify it as harmful. Instead of asking, "Why am I becoming emotionally smaller in this relationship?" you start asking, "How can I love them better so they feel more secure?" That psychological shift is powerful, because now you are no longer protecting your emotional well-being. You are protecting the relationship at the expense of yourself. And once that pattern begins, emotional control becomes easier and easier to maintain. You start adjusting your behavior automatically. You avoid situations that trigger jealousy. You avoid conversations that create tension. You become emotionally responsible for managing their reactions. And without realizing it, your emotional freedom slowly disappears. That is why emotionally unhealthy relationships often feel exhausting in ways people struggle to explain. You are constantly monitoring yourself psychologically, constantly adapting, constantly trying to avoid emotional discomfort. And eventually, your nervous system becomes trained around emotional caution instead of emotional peace. That is not healthy love. Healthy love does not require emotional shrinking to survive. Healthy love does not punish individuality. Healthy love does not make you feel guilty for existing naturally. But toxic control slowly convinces people that sacrificing parts of themselves is proof of commitment. That becoming smaller means becoming more loving. That silence means maturity. That emotional suppression means loyalty. And perhaps one of the most dangerous beliefs people develop inside emotionally controlling relationships is this: if I just love them correctly enough, things will finally feel safe. But emotional control never creates safety. It creates dependency, because once someone controls your emotional reality, they slowly begin controlling your identity too. One of the deepest forms of emotional damage happens the moment you stop trusting your own instincts. Not because you suddenly became insecure, but because the relationship slowly trained you to question yourself constantly. At first, it feels small. You express a feeling, and they tell you you're overreacting. You explain why something hurt you, and suddenly the conversation becomes about your tone instead of their behavior. You try to trust your intuition, but they convince you that you are too emotional, too sensitive, or imagining problems that don't exist. And after enough emotionally confusing experiences, something begins changing inside your mind. You stop trusting your emotional reactions naturally. You begin analyzing everything before expressing it. Am I being dramatic? Maybe I misunderstood. Maybe this really is my fault. That constant self-questioning creates psychological exhaustion, because now your mind is no longer focused on understanding reality clearly. It is focused on avoiding emotional invalidation. And eventually, you begin emotionally censoring yourself before the other person even reacts. You rehearse conversations in your head before speaking. You carefully calculate your words. You avoid expressing emotions that might create tension. Your silence instincts that once tried to protect you. That is what emotional conditioning does. It slowly disconnects people from their inner certainty. And once someone loses trust in their own perception, they become emotionally easier to control. Because now the relationship becomes the center of their emotional reality. If the other person feels loving, they feel emotionally safe. If the other person becomes distant, cold, or irritated, anxiety immediately appears. Their emotional state begins controlling your emotional stability. That is not healthy attachment. That is emotional dependence created through instability. And what makes this psychologically dangerous is that people often mistake this constant overthinking for love. They think, I just care deeply. I'm trying to understand them better. I want the relationship to work. But healthy love does not force you to constantly question your own reality. Healthy love does not make self-expression feel emotionally dangerous. Healthy love does not leave you mentally exhausted after every difficult conversation. And perhaps one of the saddest parts of emotional self-censorship is this: the more disconnected you become from your instincts, the harder it becomes to recognize what is actually hurting you. That is how people slowly lose their light without realizing it. Not because they stopped feeling things, but because they stopped trusting themselves enough to listen to what they feel. And once someone becomes emotionally disconnected from their own inner voice, something even more dangerous can happen. Their insecurity starts becoming useful to the relationship itself. One of the hardest truths to accept about emotionally unhealthy relationships is this: the smaller you become, the easier you are to keep. And that does not always mean the other person is consciously trying to destroy your confidence in some calculated way. Sometimes, emotionally unhealthy people do this without fully understanding it themselves. But psychologically, the result is still the same. When someone slowly loses confidence, independence, emotional certainty, and self-trust, they become easier to control emotionally. Because insecurity changes the way people behave inside relationships. The more insecure someone becomes, the more approval they seek. The more emotionally dependent they become, the more they tolerate behaviors they normally would never accept. The more disconnected they become from their own instincts, the more power the relationship gains over their emotional reality. That creates emotional compliance. You stop asking, is this relationship healthy for me? And start asking, how do I keep the relationship from falling apart? That shift changes everything. Because now, fear of losing the relationship becomes stronger than the desire to protect yourself emotionally. And emotionally unhealthy dynamics survive through that fear. The fear of abandonment, the fear of conflict, the fear of not being loved, the fear of becoming emotionally alone. That is why insecurity often strengthens toxic attachments instead of weakening it. The more emotionally uncertain you become, the more emotionally attached you often feel. Because now your nervous system depends on the relationship for emotional reassurance. Their approval becomes relief. Their affection becomes validation. Their attention temporarily restores the confidence the relationship slowly damaged in the first place. That cycle creates emotional dependency, and emotionally dependent people become easier to influence, because their emotional stability begins depending on external validation instead of inner security. That is why many people trapped in emotionally unhealthy relationships slowly stop recognizing their own value outside the relationship itself. They forget who they were before constantly seeking reassurance, before constantly trying to prove they were lovable enough, before constantly adapting themselves emotionally just to maintain connection. And perhaps the saddest part is this: many people begin believing the smaller version of themselves is the healthier version. They mistake emotional suppression for maturity. They mistake silence for peace. They mistake self-abandonment for love. But becoming emotionally smaller is not growth. It is survival, because real emotional growth expands people. It makes them feel safer expressing themselves, safer existing naturally, safer being authentic, not smaller, not quieter, not emotionally afraid. And even after all the emotional conditioning, one important part of you never fully disappeared. The real version of you is still there beneath the exhaustion, the self-doubt, the emotional adaptation, and the fear. And the moment you begin reconnecting with that version of yourself again, everything slowly starts changing. One of the most beautiful things about healing is realizing that the real version of you never fully disappeared. It was buried, exhausted, emotionally suppressed, but not destroyed. Because emotionally unhealthy relationships can condition people deeply, but they cannot erase who someone truly is forever. And maybe lately, you have started feeling small, emotionally tired, disconnected from yourself, unsure of your own instincts, uncertain about your own worth. Maybe you no longer recognize the person you became inside the relationship, but that does not mean your light is gone. It means your nervous system adapted to emotional survival for too long. That is an important difference, because healing is not becoming someone completely new. Healing is recovering who you were before emotional erosion convinced you that shrinking yourself was necessary to feel loved.